you guys so much for being here today. So my name is Sam. I'm the owner of Blue House Books, and this is the second time that I allowed myself to actually be part of the event, because I'm always running around working them and I never get to like have fun and actually sit and enjoy. So I'm starting to allow myself to do that. It's great. And I'm particularly excited for this one because I just stinking love spooky books. Especially this is the right season for it, so I am just super excited to be able to chat about these. I'm at least halfway or more through all of your books. So this is going to be a spoiler-free conversation because I want you guys to be able to rush and buy the books once you hear about them if you don't already have all of them. So yeah, we can go ahead and get started. If you guys can each just kind of introduce yourself and maybe give us like a little bit of a spiel about what your main book that we're going to talk about is about, so like your spooky books. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Maureen Kilmer, and I write, I guess what the marketing gods have called cozy horror, or horror comedy, basically. I like to take everyday situations that people go through, like a road trip, which is the topic of my book, Nightmare of a Trip, and then add some ghosts or demons or something spooky in there. So I'm from Chicago, and that's where I live, and my new book, Nightmare of a Trip, it's my third horror comedy, and it's about the Somerset family who decide to road trip from suburban Milwaukee, they're from Germantown, down to Orlando, Florida to a theme park called Magic Land, which is Disney. Yeah, no copyright issues, right? I've been told that we may not upset Disney, which I totally agree with. So they decide to road trip down with their 3 kids down to Florida, and they only make it to Indiana before they have car trouble. And they stumble upon an abandoned farmhouse and pick up a ghost along the way. So you have all the typically horrifying things of a road trip at motel rooms, horrifying rest stops, in addition to there's a Cracker Barrel with some spirits. They stop at an indoor water park. That can also be horrifying, but there are some spirits that decide to make their trip a little more interesting. So stay tuned.
All right.
Hi, I'm Julia Fine. I'm also from Chicago and excited to be up here for the day. I write, I guess the overarching theme of all my stuff is sort of like feminist speculative horror. Some of my books are more horror than others, but I think the one today that fits the best for this panel is The Upstairs House, which is my second novel. It came out in 2021, and it is about a new mom who has literally just given birth. It opens with her in the hospital, bringing home her first child and sort of dealing while her husband is traveling for work. And she's not sure if she is going crazy or being haunted by the ghost of Margaret Wise Brown, the real-life author of Goodnight Moon. And so the book is sort of just her journey there. And it is sort of like you were saying, Maureen, like the horrors of like postpartum parenthood and just sort of society in general, but there may or may not be a ghost. It's unclear sort of how much of what's happening is happening, and you read the book to find out more.
I don't know how to follow after this. Hi, my name is Alicia Gilmore, and I am also from Chicago. Really excited to be here. So I write speculative historical fiction. So it's historical fiction with a little bit of magic, either witches, ghosts, things like that. So my first book is The Witch and the Tsar, and it came out in 2022. And now the book that we'll be talking about, The Haunting of Moscow House, is a Gothic historical, and it is set in post-revolutionary Moscow. And it is about these 2 sisters that are living with with a group of Bolshevik men. And their house comes alive with ghosts from their past. And so they are trying to uncover the secrets of their family's past to find out what really happened to their family during the revolution.
I want to read all of these books. I'm going to. Thanks so much, Sam, for having me. I have 2 Jessica friends here who came. So,
Yay!
Thank you. Ghost Mother came out this August, and it's a psychological, literary, Gothic ghost story. I know that's not a genre, but I found my people. A woman moves into a house from Chicago to a town called Haven, Wisconsin, which is really Baraboo, Wisconsin, and moves into a house with her husband and begins to feel it's haunted. And the question is it haunted, or is she losing touch with reality? And to discover that, she investigates. Well, I'm not giving away spoilers. In chapter 3, she finds out it's the murder house. So she investigates what happened there. And so the backstory is a 1950s circus story, inspired very loosely by a house that my husband and I bought, in which the Golmar brothers had been the owners. They were first cousins of the Ringlings, and there had been a murder in that house. It is nothing like this one, but it sort of started the seed. Yeah, thank you.
By the way, Ghost Mother is the Blue House Books book club pick for October, so we're all very excited. I know some people have already finished, and yeah, we're all very excited for it. Okay, amazing. So something that I realized after I had started all of these books, and it was not at all intentional, but I feel like we have to talk about it, is the fact that parent-child relationship has a really important role in each of these books. More specifically the mother, but you know, that whole dynamic of the family, haunting when there's family around. One thing I love, Maureen, in your book is that, oh shoot, can I say that? Yeah, wait a minute. Is that, okay, well I feel like one of the things is always like, they're the only person seeing this, and that may not be the case in Maureen's book. And I was like, yeah, finally. But yeah, so family, and specifically the mother-child relationship, is a big dynamic. So if you can each tell us why that was like a situation, a role that you put into your book.
I think for me personally, so I have 3 kids, all different ages, and there's so many horrifying things about being a parent without adding any like true horror in there, you know, whether it's other parents, you know, the parent-teacher conference sign-up at midnight, or, you know, whatever it is. So I think that there's a lot that's there that, you know, we don't know how to do. Like, there's no, you know, roadmap here. So I like to take stuff like that and then add in the ghosty type stuff. And I think, too, as a mom, you know, your biggest fear is something happening to your kids. So unfortunately, in my books, the kids are haunted a lot to torture my main characters. So I think, and my editor said something to me while I was turning this book in. There's the saying, you know, so goes the mother, so goes the family. And, you know, moms are the ones that are expected to kind of keep the ship righted. And when she's going through these unexplainable, ridiculous, horrific things, she's still trying to keep herself together, but it's still trickling down to the kids. So I wanted to kind of explore that dynamic, because I think it is a parallel to, you know, we're just trying to keep our shit together, basically, and, you know, it doesn't always feel like we're accomplishing it, whether or not there's, you know, a ghost around the corner or not. Yeah.
So with the upstairs house, I had my first child was born like around the time that I sold my first book, which also has parent-child relationships, but I had not yet, you know, a lot less in depth. But for the upstairs house, I had this book that was sort of in the works, and I knew I wanted to do something else, and I had a baby, and I immediately realized that nothing I had read or seen or experienced had prepared me for the actualities of sort of that specifically first like 2 months postpartum. And so I knew, even as I was experiencing them, that I wanted to sort of focus on what I was experiencing and try to write something about it. And I initially conceived of the book as more of a psychological thriller, where it would be a woman who's up at 3 a.m. nursing her baby, who, like, you know, Rear Window style, sees something across the way. But the more that I thought about it and the more I worked on it, I was much more interested in sort of the where the me pre-motherhood had gone, and sort of the self that I had left behind and was semi-haunted by. And so it sort of evolved into this story, which also ended up bringing in Goodnight Moon, since I was reading that to my kids so many times. It really was like, how in my life, how can I take all these elements of my life and put them together? but the mother-child element of it really, I was very interested in like what would happen to me and my work and sort of the artistic side of me now that I had a baby. And I think these are common things that people have been writing about and talking about a lot. But I felt like pairing them with that initial sort of very hormonal, very emotional, like there's a lot of mood disorders that women will have postpartum, and the experience is just like, you can't prepare for it really until it happens to you, even if you've been adjacent to somebody, like until it is, your child, it's just not the same. And so it felt like sort of a ghost story was a way to talk about like the selves that you sort of leave behind in pursuit of a new self when you have a kid. And I also was interested in taking some of the feelings, like I retrospectively can see that I definitely was experiencing some postpartum depression, but because the exposure that I had to it, this is taking it in a real weird way, but the exposure I had to it was all like, this woman snaps and does this to her children. Like, it wasn't, I didn't feel, I felt like, oh my gosh, like I should just get over it, I should get through it, and I felt like shame that I had those feelings. And then the more I talked to people, the more I was like, no, this is such a common thing, it's really normal. And so I wanted also to like explore those feelings and put them out there so that other new parents who might also be having these feelings could read it and be like, okay, this is not like, I'm not losing it, even if the character in this book is. And so I wanted to just take sort of some of those natural feelings and like how far can you push them, and that's what I feel like horror is like the common things that you just like push into this extreme space. So all that to say, having a child really inspired me to write.
And then really quick, Alicia, I want to make sure we're not spoiling anything by you talking about what I think you're going to talk about, am I? This dynamic?
I won't be specific.
Okay, go ahead.
So yeah, to that end, I'll talk about family in general, just because I feel like my book is about family. So it's actually based on a real family that existed. They were former aristocrats, and with the revolution, the monarchy fell, and all these people basically became non-people. So the Soviet government named them former people. So essentially, they just had no status in society. So it was very interesting for me to learn about the real families that inspired my book. And of course, as you may imagine, the revolution was just such a cataclysmic event for everyone in Russia, but especially these people, because a lot of them lost family members, a lot of them were attacked, killed, and so it was just and some of them left, some of them went into exile, moving to places like America, France, etc. And so some of these people stayed in Russia, and they kept to their kind of ideal of family and house. A lot of these people would not let their houses go. And so even though they were appropriated by the government at that time, they clung to them as, they would just live in the attics of their houses, in the basements of their houses, whatever the Soviet government would let them. And so for me, that concept of family and house was an incredibly important aspect of the haunted house story, because they would live in these houses that were old, and they would have these relics of their glorious past. I'm talking about paintings and all these decorative arts and furniture, and it would all stay as it was before. And so I just found that idea incredibly powerful, because you had these people living in a very stark present, trying to keep their family alive in a time when it was very difficult to do so. And so that really inspired me, and kind of the hauntings where the family is, their dead family that died during the revolution is essentially coming back and whispering about the secrets of what really happened to them during this really horrifying time. And so for me, that concept of family, and of course there's also kind of like a folkloric aspect to it, because in pagan Slavic belief, the concept of the house and the concept of spirits of the house and ancestors of the house is very powerful. So I'm not going to talk any more about that, because that would be spoiler territory. But that was a very important part of my research in kind of developing the more haunting and folkloric aspects of the story.
My mom got cancer when I was 7 and died when I was in college. And I think it's just hard for me to remember a time when I wasn't thinking about death and the afterlife. And I think as writers, and maybe humans, we choose our characters, our plots, but our obsessions sort of choose us. So that idea of just being interested in what we can't see has always fascinated me. Lily, my character, moves into a house and she wants to be a mother, and I also dealt with infertility issues, so that was able to inform my writing. I have a happy, healthy baby who's now 22, but that was part of it too, was just trying to remember those feelings and emotions as I was writing so that it would feel real for the readers. Lily is struggling with this, and does she get her baby or not?
I will be finding out soon.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So another thing that I did not realize before going into reading all of these books is that at their core, these are all haunted house stories. So Maureen, I know yours is more about the road trip, but it starts with that haunted house, and then that's kind of what it is, whether it is actually a haunting or not, which you'll find out when you read. And so I want to know, what type of supernatural lore did you study in preparation for your books? And even if it wasn't intentional, maybe you just loved watching horror movies as a kid or your whole life, and that is what, but there's always a technicality, even when something is paranormal, how does this work? What is the logic behind it? What kind of research did you do to help with your books?
So I've been a horror fan my whole life. It started when I was 6, and I had an interesting babysitter who showed me Poltergeist. And my parents were horrified, and I was like, no, it's great. She didn't come back, unfortunately. So I've always been a fan of horror in general, because I feel like horror, when you watch something like Halloween, yes, it's about Michael Myers, but really when you kind of dig into it, it's about being a babysitter and being alone, and the kids are in real danger and you're the only thing standing in between them. Or if you watch it, when I rewatched it as a parent, you've left your kids alone and this, crazy Michael Myers is running around. So it takes those fears and elevates them in a way that you can kind of watch it and go, okay, well, that probably won't happen to me, but you can still explore, and then, people make it out in the end. So I've always been a fan of horror. For this book, so in the book, as I said, they make it to Indiana, and they come across this half-burned, abandoned farmhouse. Super creepy. They do the #1 wrong thing that you're supposed to do in horror, which is they investigate. And the son picks up in the dirt an old rusted locket, and he's like, can I keep this? And the parents are like, absolutely not. And of course he keeps it. And then thus starts the haunting. So I based that creepy old farmhouse on a house that's actually around the corner from my parents' house. And, and growing up, it's one of those pieces of property where you go by it and you're like, something happened there. It just feels odd. There was a half crumbled house, there was an old well on the property, and no one really knew what happened. It's still nothing has ever been built there. So of course, high schoolers bring your Ouija boards there, which I was one. And so they wound up tearing the house down eventually, but the land is still there, and there's still something there. So one time, my brother and I were like, okay, let's Google this. I don't even think it was Google at that point. Whatever, that was a GeoCities webpage where we found this. And the legend behind it was there was a family that lived there, but they disappeared one night in the middle of the night with their car running in the driveway. And no one ever heard from them. So I always kind of had that in the back of my mind. I was like, that needs to go in the book. And now it has. But so I paired that with the road trip element and had the ghost kind of follow them along. But that is actually based off of an actual family that lived there.
Amazing, so cool.
Yeah, so for the upstairs house, like I said, I was coming off of my first book, which has been a very research-heavy sort of folklore and mythology and fairy tales, and I'd done a lot of research and read a lot of sort of esoteric stuff for that, and so I thought to myself, I'm going to do something that doesn't require it, which of course, you always end up with research. But I initially was inspired by The Turn of the Screw, which is the Henry James novel where the nanny may or may not be seeing a ghost, and you never really know, and it's unclear if other people are like gaslighting her or if it's actually happening. And so I wanted to sort of take that vibe, which is horror, but it's not like explicit horror in the way that like this is a ghost or this, it's unexplained, which is all the more horrifying, I think, sometimes when it's unexplained. So I started there, and then of course I had Goodnight Moon, which in itself is sort of a horror story / prayer. Like it's such an interesting book, and I was very intrigued by the page in Goodnight Moon where they say goodnight. They introduce all the things, they say goodnight to all the things, and then there's a blank page that just says goodnight nobody. And so that was the starting point there, where I thought like, who wrote this book? It was probably the that I had read it and like read that book because it was my like get your kids to sleep, sort of read the same book every night kind of situation that never works. But so I read it and I was like, I wonder who wrote this, because this is really weird and not enough people talk about how this is creepy. And like the lights get darker and darker, it's just creepy. And so then I started researching Margaret Wise Brown, and the more I found out about her, like she was bisexual, she died at 40. She was obsessed with rabbit hunting. She like covered her house in different furs of different animals. She like had this cabin in Maine where she'd swim naked. Like she's just a weirdo in the best possible way. And I felt like this is not like I want the world to know who she actually was. And so the sort of combination of all of those things, like the research sort of triangulated, I think. And I mean, there definitely is a world in which Margaret Wise Brown gets a novel where she's not, at the center of a horror story. But because of what I was interested in and because of like the specifics of her work and what I wanted to look at in her work, I sort of triangulated it that way.
Yeah, so my experience was similar from the beginning, like yours, where I was coming off of a novel that I wrote that was fantasy, historical fantasy, and it was so much mythology, fairy tales, all of it, history. And I knew I wanted to write a Gothic novel, and just started rereading a lot of my favorite, specifically Gothic horror, but also specifically Gothic and specifically haunted house novels. So Haunting of Hill House, for example, of course, Haunting of Moscow House is a play on that. And Rebecca and Northanger Abbey, and just some of my favorite books like that were really, really great to reread. And I realized when I started to reread those books that they were kind of the first books that I fell in love with, which was really interesting too, except for Jane Austen. Jane Austen was my first love, probably. But after that, it was really Gothic literature. I mean, it was, Emily Bronte and, Dracula and Frankenstein. I mean, those were my first loves. Those were where I really got passionate about literature. And it took me starting this book to realize that. And so, and then I kind of went into contemporary Gothic novels too, like the staples, Mexican Gothic and the Hacienda were really big inspirations, especially kind of their treatment of culture, a different culture than what we're used to, which is usually American and England for Gothic novels. So that really inspired me to, films like Crimson Peak was a huge inspiration as well. Because I wanted something old world, but also kind of classic haunted house. I was really going for the classic haunted house story with just the cultural historical twist. And to that end, I actually went back and reread a lot of the stories of kind of the founding father of Russian Gothic literature, who was Nikolai Gogol. And so it was really interesting to reread them because I remember a lot of his stories because my grandfather used to read them to me when I was like 5. So I think my mom still wonders why I couldn't sleep because he would show me like the scariest of his stories, like the film. So this was this dead girl coming back to life and haunting this guy that had wronged her. So essentially, like he showed me that movie at 5 years old, and so I feel like I still can't sleep because of that. But I think I realized too that it just instilled in me such a fascination with scary stories, with Gothic literature, with classical Gothic, which is what I really envisioned this book as. And I already talked a little bit about kind of the folkloric aspects too, but I did some of that research too, where I looked into kind of old Slavic pagan beliefs on the home and the spirits and the ancestors that were worshipped. So that was a really fun part of my research that kind of continued from my first book, where I sort of, read a lot of fairy tales and some kind of stories that were a little more, yeah, folkloric. So that was fun.
My main literary inspiration was Turn of the Screw. Just that question, are the ghosts real, or is the narrator losing touch with reality? And what I love about what James does is he makes both equally scary. If the ghosts are real, that's pretty scary. If the governess who's in charge of 2 kids is going crazy, that's pretty scary. So I wanted to create that in my own book. I was also inspired by Rosemary's Baby. So amazing that Polanski created such a feminist film, but somehow it happened. I pretty much read every ghost story I could get my hands on because I want to know what is out there so that I don't think I'm doing something new, and it's been done a lot, and trying to put, original spin. But I think the best haunted house stories are about haunted people. So I was most interested in what was haunting my character. And I'm not sure that took research as much as digging deep. But when I would tell people I'm writing a ghost story, they would say, "Oh, I've got a ghost story to tell you." And I loved listening to those because I felt like that was, if she's haunted as a person, there still needs to be external evidence of that, at least in her mind. So I got a lot of great inspiration from people's stories. And if you want to tell me a ghost story, I'm all ears.
That's awesome. So the topic that I have up on the screen here is how authors bring the chills with just the written word. Because movies and TV shows, they get 2 of your major senses. They get the sight and they get the sounds, and so you get the jump scares really good, things like that. And I just feel like with writing, there's so much more technique to it, or maybe you guys will just tell me, no, I just go for it, which is also great to know. But I think it takes such a talent to actually be able to creep someone out with just writing, with just words. So do you guys have any special techniques? Do you have partners who are creeped out all the time because you keep following them around with creepy stories? Do you test it on anyone? How do you do that?
I think for me it's hard because not much scares me. I'm such a horror fan that it takes a lot to really creep me out. So with the books that I write, and what I find horrifying is, again, to take those everyday situations and turn up the dial. In my first book, Suburban Hell, some of the toys wake up a little bit in the Target toy aisle, which I'm with my kids all the time. So, and again, if you go back to horror as really just amplifying your fear and doing it in an elevated way, I think that it's even better if you take it and you put it in that suburban location or wherever you live, and it's in your house and it's part of your routine, or and your kids are involved. And so for me, that's what's the most scary. It's not necessarily like Michael Myers chasing you down the street. So it's something, yeah, I'm just like, so late. So I think for me, taking things around me that I can elevate, and things that are a part of my everyday life, and again, they're already somewhat horrifying, and then putting an actual threatening spirit or demon, whatever it is, that's what's scary to me. So that's what I write about.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I agree also with what Kelly was saying about, for me, the scariest thing is less the fantastical monsters and more what people who you think are good people, or people who you have seen make good choices in the past, what they'll do when pushed to the brink. And so I feel like in all of my work, the horror comes from watching somebody sort of descend into whatever it is they're descending, whether it's rage or madness or jealousy or what people, what everyday people will do. And I think that's the scariest thing about the real world too. And when you do it, when you're writing it in fiction, especially adding a speculative element, I think you get a little bit of reprieve from the fact that this happens on the street every day, because you're able to look at it sort of through these different themes. But ultimately, I think, having, there's a scene in my first book where the horses, the dead horses, reanimate. To me, that's not the scary part. The scary part is the people who are, going after like these things that they want at the expense of everybody else. Like the scary things in the real world are the scary things in horror, and so I think like leaning into those things and then sort of filtering them sometimes through the more speculative stuff, like for the sake of the narrative or to pay homage to other books or to different cultures. But yeah, it's the people.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with both of those. My book is very similar. I actually have 2 characters talking about that in the book, where my main character is talking to another character. And basically, you know, they're talking about Nikolai Gogol, who's the author I mentioned. And, you know, she notices him reading Gogol. And she's like, well, did you learn anything new? Like, we've already read all his stories. And he's like, yeah, to be more afraid of real men versus ghosts. And I think that's definitely true for my characters, and I think it'll continue to be true with the books I write, because the real historical situation, the real situation where my characters found themselves in, that's the scary situation. I mean, to live alongside essentially your enemies, people that, you know, killed your part of your family. And to see your family come alive is more, it's sad, and it's, you know, it can be scary because they might be different from who they were before. But the scary situation is them living with these men, with these Soviet men that persecuted them and continue to persecute them. And the other thing that specifically with these former people, former aristocrats, they continue to be pursued. Even after the revolution, through Stalin's reign, through 1930s, they continued to be pursued by the Soviet regime because, you know, it did not see a place for them in the new society. So my sisters, my protagonist sisters, are experiencing some of that when they go to work for an American organization that it was really operating in Russia in 1921, starting in 1921. And because they work for the Americans, they are given even more persecution than other Russians. So it was a very scary time for not only people that decided to work for Americans, but also just people that maybe had a different background to kind of the main party. And as a result, they were persecuted, and their life was always in danger. And so that was the scary situation for me in my book, is these sisters are not only experiencing hauntings in their ancestral house, but they're also experiencing hauntings of a real sort through real things that are happening to them.
You asked about technique, and who was it? One of you said, sometimes I can't remember if it was a book or a movie. And I think we, as readers, that's what we love, right? When we see it unfold before our eyes, and you can't even remember if it was a book or a movie because it felt so real. So in terms of technique, Sam, I think I just try and see, well, I do see everything, as you know, any of you who write or read know this, you just see everything unfold. And then it's just a matter of getting down as you see it, so you're making it come alive for the reader. And on a very technical level, I'd say getting in something spooky, it's always effective to have, you know, short sentences after long ones. So sometimes the long ones can be descriptive, and then when things get spookier, it almost matches a heartbeat, you know, where you use shorter sentences. I don't think Ghost Mother is like super scary. Maybe it's cozy, spooky, or something like that.
I call it cozy. Definitely creepy.
Thank you. But that's, anyway, those are some, I guess, techniques I imagine.
Yeah, I love that. And that's so true. Like, you know, when you can picture it so vividly in your head that it really is coming to life for you, that's so true. And then, yeah, like I'm a big punctuation advocate over here, Oxford comma till I die. And so using those tools to really, you know, punctuate what you're trying to say and really give it the right vibes. I love that. That's the perfect way to describe it. Okay, so a little more of like a technical kind of thing. I always love asking authors if they are plotters or pantsers. So if you don't know what this is, a plotter is somebody who ahead of time, they have an outline, the book is almost written in like notes format before it's actually written out. And then a pantser flies by the seat of their pants. They just sit down and they start writing and they don't even know how it's gonna end. And some people say they are a plantser. They're kind of somewhere in the middle. And so when we're talking about like your character's backstory and the setting and things like that, which one are you? How much did you kind of know ahead of time, or what did you just kind of let flow? Or maybe did something change? Did you have one ending in mind, but it went somewhere else? Just how did that flow for you?
So I would love to be a pantser, but my publisher doesn't let me. So the books that I've sold, so I've written about 50 to 60 pages and then a synopsis, and my publisher has offered based on that. So, and I hate writing a synopsis. I think almost every author. It's like single spaced. It's like a Wikipedia like plot summary basically. So I have to sit down and figure out what's going to happen in the book before I actually write it, which isn't as fun for me. Now I deviate from that somewhat, a little bit. I mean, nothing major, but when I usually sit down to start writing, I just kind of the concept in my head, and I play around with it and kind of just get some stuff on paper before I go back and edit and have to write the synopsis. And I generally know the direction that I'm going in. I sort of know how it's going to end. But for me, that's the fun stuff. The fun stuff is when you're writing and you're like, oh, really? That's gonna, like, it's the surprises. And certainly, again, I've gone back and changed stuff, and my editor's been cool with it. But, I like to let my characters surprise me in whatever way that I can, because for me, the most fun part is the revision, is when you kind of have the roadmap there, you have, sort of enough words written for a whole book, but then you get to go back and add the really fun stuff in. And I love, too, when I go back and I read stuff and I'm like, that was smart to put that there. I didn't even know and you're like, hey, because I think sometimes stuff just comes from the subconscious as you're writing, and then you don't even realize it. You come back, you're like, well, that totally worked. I mean, in a perfect world, I would just be able to pants the entire thing, but unfortunately for the business side, I'm not allowed to do that. So I do it when I can. I also love to change character names, which gets me in a lot of trouble, because I was working on this new proposal, and one of my author friends the other day was reading it, and she's like, who's Josh? I thought her brother was Patrick. And I was like, oh, he is. So finding her place doesn't always catch on.
Right.
So yay.
I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I like to, there's no way I could write off of like a strict outline, because I feel like all the joy and all the fun and all the creativity sort of like seeps out of me the second I'm like, this has to happen here. But I do like to know, I want to say it's Anne Lamott in Bird by Bird, who talks about writing a book as like, you have your headlights on, and so you can see, like, your destination, you have your headlights on, you can see a few feet in front of you, and then you just like take the road. And that's sort of how I'm pretty sure that's where that's from. But I like to think of it that way, so I like to know sort of generally, not necessarily how it's going to end, but what the like 2/3 point, like what the big sort of climactic thing is going to be, just so I can write toward it and not write myself off of cliffs. And then I like to know like what the next scene is going to be, and I sort of figure out what the next scene is going to be as I'm working on like 2 back. It's sort of like a batting order where you have like on deck and in the hole. So I know sort of that in the back of my mind, which is helpful, because with my first book, which I wrote in a very different phase of life, like I was in grad school, I didn't have children, I didn't have like voices in my head from like the publishing industry, but that one it took me a lot longer to write, and I just wrote it in this direction and it cut 100 pages. Wrote in that direction and cut 100 pages, and I resolved like not to do that again, which is why I think I need the map, but I need it to be like open-ended enough that I don't feel like I'm like all the joy of it is squeezed out.
Yeah, no, I'm actually very similar to that. I actually started very rigid because I came from being a lawyer. So I was like, okay, I need an outline, I need all these character profiles, I need to do all of this stuff that, ahead of time, and then I'm going to follow it faithfully. And it just didn't work, because I think I discovered after writing my first book and the second and third and fourth, I started to realize that you discover so much about your story, your characters. You just can't anticipate everything, and also you don't really want to. Like I said, the joy is really finding the story, finding the characters, learning about all of that. And you can only do that through the writing process. So it's interesting, book after book, I've kind of gone more and more off my outlines. And I'm also similar to Maureen. My publisher does require for me to write a pitch, a synopsis, as well as the first 3 or 4 chapters. So that's about 30 to 40 pages. So it does require me to do an outline and all that preparatory material, but then I'm very much, okay, I write that, and then I just give myself license to be like, okay, I can go off of that. The chapter by chapter outline, I feel like, is just literally a few sentences each instead of the paragraphs that I would do initially. So right now it's very much just a guide to what I think the story will be. And invariably, I feel like about 100 to 150 pages in, I change everything. I go back, I rewrite the first 100 pages, and it's very chaotic time, and my husband can tell you that I'm just a complete terror when that happens because I'm panicking and I'm like, I don't have a book anymore. But somehow I just kind of find my way through the writing process, which is the magic of it, right? And so I have that freak out, and then I'm like, okay, I'll fix up all the stuff I have, and then I'm gonna keep going, and then it works out. Magically works out at the end.
Your technique is magic.
I studied English and creative writing at Oberlin. I got an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and in those 6 years of formal education, I don't think I ever heard the word plot. So at some point, I was like, well, I do want readers, so I had to teach myself how to plot. And you know, sometimes, if any of you are teachers, you know that you learn so much from teaching something. So now I teach at the Iowa Summer Writing Festival from University of Iowa, in person and online, and the director calls me the plot whisperer, and I always think, if my 25-year-old self could see me now. But I have found it very useful, after not plotting, to create a plot, which I am free to deviate from. But for me, a plot is really a character arc. So I think it's about how does the character change and what scenes get them to change. You know, how does Scrooge go from Scrooge to being, every day is Christmas. So it's really through those scenes. So it's really plotting those scenes, and I really enjoy doing that now. But as people mention, I mean, you get to know your characters and things change, but I do find it helpful.
You would think publishers would just understand that, like, writers are creative people and this is not how they work. Let's not force them to do this, but apparently not. They're so business-minded. It's very unfortunate. Okay, so my last question, and if we can go through this one kind of quickly just so that we have time for questions from the audience if there are any. Do you have a real-life ghost story? Have you ever been haunted? Do you think you might have been? Or do you just know of one? What?
I'm so sad that I have
Someone haunt me!
ghosts, please haunt me. I would love to be haunted. And they won't. Probably because I want them to. No,
Okay.
like, hey.
Come to my store, go in the basement, and you'll meet George.
Hey.
Okay, I want to meet George. Sounds great.
Perfect.
Okay, deal.
I don't really have one either. Nothing good. I have like times where I thought maybe this is it, and then it's like, oh no, my new house is just next to church, and those are church bells.
Wait, my store
I was like, yes, it's
church
here.
bells.
Yeah,
Perfect.
it's finally here, and then it's like, oh, but they're ringing every day at the same time. Okay, I see what's happening.
Yeah, same with me. I have never been haunted. I've never seen a ghost, and I'm like actually deathly afraid of them.
So you're okay with not?
Well, but like I'm really scared. Like I can't stay in our house, which is, by the way, a pretty new house, and I can't stay in it by myself. Like I require someone to stay with me, like my mom or my husband when he goes on his trip. And I'm like scared. Like I will literally not sleep all night long because I imagine myself seeing something.
You're haunted by your own thoughts.
Yes, yes. Maybe that's why I wrote a book literally about about, people being haunted by their past. But yeah, I just start thinking about, everyone who's died and my grandparents, and I'm thinking, are they going to walk into my bedroom?
Oh my
it's just crazy. And so I guess that's why I wrote this book, is that, I'm scared of haunted houses, so I was like, I'm just going to power through.
Face my fears.
Yes.
Kelly, anything from you?
I have not experienced it firsthand, but I've heard a lot of great ghost stories, and my favorite is my grandmother's. She had a bird in a bird cage, fake, like a fabric bird in a gold bird cage. It was a music box, and it hadn't worked for many years. Her brother had given it to her, and when her brother died, the bird started singing. And for a while after that, whenever she would grieve her brother, sit down and cry, the bird started singing for about a week. So, yeah.
That is so
I want a ghost story like that.
Well, and if you guys have any, come and chat with these authors. They need inspo for their next books. But yeah, George is the Blue House Books ghost, by the way. We used to come in the morning and there would just randomly be a book on the floor. So we'd be like, oh, George is reading romance today. Right. So that's George.
I think that's what all of us would do, right?
Yeah. And then
Find a nice
we
book
become
store.
friends so that he doesn't scare us. We respect him, he respects us. It's a happy haunting. Okay, I want to open it up to any questions from the audience. Gail.
Hi. I wanted to ask Alicia, is there a Russian tradition of horror as opposed to Gothic? I mean, I'm aware of Gogol's stories. Do you draw on anybody else?
Honestly, I learned a lot about 20th century horror authors, and specifically I read this wonderful book, and I can look that up for you, but it was amazing because it was a lot of authors that I knew, Russian authors that I knew, that I didn't know they dabbled in horror. Like, for example, Mikhail Bulgakov, who wrote Master and Margarita, he actually wrote ghost stories too, stories about seances and other things like that. So I did find out more about the horror genre. But just in general, I think in Russia there's just more of a spiritualist tradition to the books. Even the classics that you all know, like Dostoevsky mentions Baba Yaga, who's the Slavic witch, about in my first book. So I mean, it's very much present, Alexander Pushkin as well. So you have a lot of classical Russian authors that are very spiritual. You'll find mentions of ghosts, of demons, of witches, of, all of that stuff, seances. That is just kind of inherent to the Russian literary tradition. So yeah, that was really interesting that I learned as well. But Gogol is kind of the go-to for sure in Russian literature. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Also, I did just want to mention quick that the other books that the authors have mentioned their own books. I don't have Nikolai Gogol, but their books. I do have other of theirs books up at the register table too. So if they mentioned another one that sounded intriguing, we have most of those as well. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
What book have you been reading or have you read lately that you would recommend? Any genre.
Or otherwise, anything. We love knowing what writers read.
I've read recently and loved Diavola by Jennifer Thorne. It's about a family who goes on this family vacation to Italy and stays in this villa, and then they're haunted by this spirit. But it's really about the family dynamics. They're all fighting with each other, and that's really the scary part. But I thought it was super creepy. I also just started House of Leaves. I don't know if anyone.
We have that store. It's crazy.
It's
I haven't read it yet, but
it's parts of it you have to hold up to a mirror.
Yeah.
I gotta
very
take 6
multimedia.
months off
Yeah.
and read this, but that's
It's
this
intense.
classic horror
Yeah.
book that I really have to give myself up to get through.
Yeah.
Oh man, I have two. One is, I was actually just telling Lacey about a book that's coming out in February called Maya and Natasha, that's about two ballerinas at the Kirov Ballet in the 60s in Russia who are sort of sent out as emissaries of the USSR. And you can see why I was like, oh, this could be some, but I'm also currently reading The Talented Mr. Ripley, which I had never read before, and it's the most terrifying. It's nothing, just the tension is so intense that even when nothing is actually happening, I just want to crawl out of my skin. It's really great.
I'll talk about two as well. One is semi-recent read. It was Silver Nitrate by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Yeah. And I can't wait for the one that just came out. I unfortunately haven't read it yet, but I loved Silver Nitrate. I loved how her writing is just getting so sophisticated. Not that it wasn't, but it's getting even more sophisticated. And the focus on the characters was just incredible to me. And just the film industry, that the whole idea is it's about this couple who are trying to figure out what happened to this lost film. And so there's just a lot of really cool, spooky elements with regards to the film industry. And I just found that really unique and lots of fun, just because I love film and love Hollywood and stories about Hollywood. So that was really cool to kind of juxtapose that with ghosts and seances and stuff like that. And then the other book that I'm actually currently reading is Berlin Letters by Catherine Ray. It's a historical fiction about the putting up and then the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that's been really great. It's my first book by her, and I love it. So.
Remind me later, I have a book suggestion for you based on the Hollywood that you mentioned.
Oh, I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good question. I guess my favorite horror book that I've read recently is Mr. Magic by Kirsten White. I love horror books that are about something, and that one deals with racism and sexism and homophobia and TV shows in the 90s, and I just loved it. I'm listening to, and for people who say listening isn't reading, I'll have you know it's a 30-hour listen to Anna Karenina, and I really think that is the first feminist novel. And if you read like I do, what is it like to be another person? We only get sort of one life, but when we read, we feel like we get all these other lives. Read Anna Karenina, and you'll feel like you know everyone better than you know your friends. Just great character development. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's a wrap for today. Thank you guys all so much.